A prince marries an ugly maid to get revenge on the king. But on their wedding night, he was shocked to discover that she is a cold wind swept across the kingdom of Westbrook, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant mountains. The gray stone walls of the royal palace loomed against the darkening sky, their shadows stretching across the courtyard like grasping fingers. Inside those walls, 12-year-old Prince Thomas stood frozen in the corridor outside the royal dining hall, his small hand pressed against the heavy oak door, listening to the commotion within. "The queen has collapsed," a voice shouted. "Call the royal physician immediately." Thomas pushed the door open, his eyes widening at the sight before him. His mother, Queen Virginia, lay sprawled on the marble floor. Her golden hair fanned out around her head like a halo. Her face, usually warm and full of life, had turned ashen, lips tinged with blue. Beside her fallen goblet, dark red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood. "Mother," Thomas cried, rushing forward only to be caught by strong hands. He looked up to see the Duke of Blackwood's stern face. "Stay back, Your Highness," the Duke commanded. "It's not proper for you to see this." From the head of the table, King Maxwell rose slowly. Thomas watched his father's face, searching for signs of distress or grief, but found only a tight-lipped expression that resembled irritation more than sorrow. "Take the boy to his chambers," Maxwell ordered, his voice as cold as the castle stones. As the Duke dragged him away, Thomas caught sight of the Countess of Hawthorne's face. Unlike the other shocked courtiers, she wore a strange, satisfied smile that would haunt Thomas's dreams for years to come. Later that night, as Thomas huddled in his bed, Lady Margaret, his mother's trusted lady-in-waiting, slipped into his room. Her eyes were red-rimmed, hands trembling as she sat beside him. "Your mother has died, my prince," she whispered, voice cracking. "They're saying she was poisoned." "Who would do such a thing?" Thomas asked, tears streaming down his cheeks. Lady Margaret glanced nervously at the door before leaning closer. "Your mother feared for her life these past weeks. She discovered something about your father's plans for the neighboring kingdom of Fairhaven." Before she could continue, the door burst open. King Maxwell stood in the doorway, his imposing figure backlit by the torches in the hall. "What are you telling my son, woman?" he growled. "Only that his mother has passed, Your Majesty," Lady Margaret replied, dropping into a deep curtsy. The king's eyes narrowed. "Leave us." Once alone with his son, alone with... Maxwell's demeanor changed entirely. His voice, usually commanding, dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Your mother was a traitor to this crown, boy. Remember that?" "No," Thomas protested, finding courage despite his fear. "Mother would never..." The slap came swiftly, leaving a stinging mark on his cheek. "You will hold your tongue," Maxwell hissed. "Tomorrow, you leave for the northern border. General Wilson will teach you what it means to be a Prince of Westbrook. You'll learn warfare, strategy, and how to command men. Things your mother was making you too soft to understand." Thomas spent that night sobbing into his pillow, the scent of his mother's lavender perfume still lingering on the handkerchief she had given him the day before. The years passed slowly on the frozen northern border. Thomas grew from a grief-stricken boy into a hardened young man, his body forged in combat, his mind sharpened by strategy. The soft-spoken child who once loved poetry and music disappeared beneath layers of armor, both physical and emotional. Only in his dreams did Thomas allow himself to remember his mother's gentle touch and the sound of her laughter. In waking hours, he built his life around a single purpose, preparing for the day he would return to the capital and confront his father. At 15, he received his first battle scar, a jagged line across his right cheek from a rebel's blade. By 17, he had led his first successful campaign against mountain brigands. By 20, soldiers whispered his name with a mixture of respect and fear. "He fights like a man possessed," they said, as if he's trying to kill his own demons with every enemy that falls. Captain Wilson, the gruff commander who had become Thomas's reluctant mentor, recognized the darkness growing within his young charge. Late one night, as they sat by the campfire after a brutal skirmish, Wilson studied Thomas's face in the flickering light. "You've become a fine warrior," he said, "but I worry about what drives you." Thomas stared into the flames. "I only do what my father wished. I've become strong. There's a difference between strength and hatred, my prince. One builds, the other destroys. Wilson hesitated. I served your mother before you were born. She was kind, but make no mistake, she was strong. Thomas's head snapped up. What do you know about her death? Wilson glanced around to ensure they were alone. Only rumors, but some say the king feared she would expose his plans to conquer Fairhaven. The attack came just 3 days after her death, too soon to be coincidence. Thomas clutched the dagger at his belt. One day, I'll return to the capital and learn the truth. Wilson placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. When that day comes, remember that revenge is a poison that kills the vessel that holds it. But Thomas was beyond such wisdom. In the privacy of his tent, he kept a small wooden box containing his most precious possessions, his mother's handkerchief, now faded and worn, and a detailed map of the palace, including secret passages and hidden chambers that few knew existed. 7 years after his exile, a royal messenger arrived at the northern outpost. Thomas was summoned back to the capital. King Maxwell was arranging a marriage alliance with the Princess of Oakshire, and the Crown Prince's presence was required. As Thomas rode through the gates of Westbrook, banners flying in honor of his victorious return from the wars, he felt nothing but cold determination. The city had changed little. The same stone buildings, the same cobbled streets, yet everything looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than in his childhood memories. The palace, once a place of wonder and terror, now seemed merely a structure of stone and mortar, a fortress he had learned how to conquer. King Maxwell greeted his son in the throne room, surrounded by courtiers. The years had not been kind to the king. His hair had grayed, and lines of worry creased his brow. Yet his eyes remained as cold as Thomas remembered. My son returns a conquering hero, Maxwell declared, his voice echoing through the hall. The victor of Pinecrest, the sword of Westbrook. Thomas knelt as protocol demanded, but his oath of fealty tasted like ash in his mouth later in private chambers. The king revealed his true purpose. The Princess of Oakshire arrives in a fortnight. Her kingdom possesses the mountain passes we need to secure our eastern border. This marriage will cement our alliance. Thomas nodded, betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. As you wish, father, as servants showed him to his royal chambers. Thomas ran his fingers along the familiar walls, remembering hidden passages and secret corners. The palace was alive with whispers and watchful eyes. He would need to move carefully, observe quietly, and plan meticulously. The time for his revenge was approaching. But first he needed to understand the court as it stood now. Who held power? Who harbored resentment against the king? And most importantly, who might remember the truth about his mother's death? Thomas stood at his chamber window, looking out over the kingdom that would one day be his. His reflection in the glass showed a handsome but severe face, marked by the scar that cut across his cheek, a permanent reminder that even royal blood could spill. I've returned, mother, he whispered to the night sky, and I will have justice. The royal stables reeked of hay and horsehide, the earthy scent mingling with the crisp morning air. Melissa wiped sweat from her brow with the back of a dirt-smudged hand, careful not to touch the kerchief that concealed her hair. Unlike the other servants who allowed strands to escape their coverings, she kept hers meticulously hidden, a habit that earned her teasing from fellow stable hands. Got something to hide under there, Mel. Jacob, the head stable boy, often joked. Secret princess hair, perhaps. If only he knew how close to the truth his jests came. Melissa shoveled fresh hay into the stall of the king's prized stallion, her movements efficient from years of practice. At 20, she had spent more than half her life in the royal stables, having arrived as a frightened 8-year-old orphan with Mrs. Johnson, the palace's former cook who had taken her in. Remember, child, Mrs. Johnson had whispered on her deathbed just a month ago. Keep your head down, but never your eyes. The old woman had pressed a small wooden box into Melissa's hands. When you're alone, read what's inside. It will tell you who you truly are. The box now lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the tiny attic room she called home. She had read its contents only once, the shocking revelations leaving her trembling with disbelief and anger. According to the papers, she wasn't Melissa the stable girl at all, but Scarlet, the lost princess of Fairhaven, the kingdom King Maxwell had destroyed 15 years ago. Daydreaming again, barked Master Fletcher, the stable master. The prince's mount needs grooming. He's inspecting the royal guard this afternoon. Melissa nodded silently, picking up a brush and heading toward the magnificent chestnut stallion in the corner stall. As she worked, she allowed her mind to wander to the strange new awareness that had settled over her since reading the documents. The royal emblem of Fairhaven, a silver star surrounded by 3 crescent moons, matched exactly the birthmark near her collarbone that she had always kept hidden. Could it really be true? Or had Mrs. Johnson, in her final days, succumbed to delusion? The soft whickering of horses gave way to the sound of approaching hoofbeats and shouted commands. Melissa stepped back into the shadows as the stable doors swung open, and a royal procession entered. Guards in polished armor flanked a tall figure mounted on a midnight black stallion. Prince Thomas, returned from the northern borders. Melissa had glimpsed him only from afar when they were children. Now, he cut an imposing figure. His dark hair was pulled back tightly, accentuating high cheekbones and a strong jaw marked by a jagged scar that seemed to carve a permanent frown onto his face. His eyes, a startling ice blue, scanned the stables with the calculated assessment of a predator. "You?" He pointed at Master Fletcher. "Have your best groom ready my mount in 1 hour." Master Fletcher bowed low. "Of course, Your Highness, Melissa," he called, gesturing frantically. "Our finest with horses." Melissa stepped forward, keeping her gaze lowered as she had been taught. Yet as the prince dismounted, something made her look up. Perhaps Mrs. Johnson's final advice echoing in her mind. Thomas's cold eyes met hers, and for a moment, something flashed across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at a mere stable girl daring to meet his gaze. Unlike the other servants who cowered before nobility, Melissa stood straight, her eyes level. "Can you handle Tempest?" he asked, an edge of challenge in his voice as he gestured to his war-trained stallion. "Yes, Your Highness," she replied simply. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but a flicker of interest. "See that he's properly cooled down. He's been pushed hard on the journey." As the prince strode from the stables, Melissa released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. There was something in his manner, a controlled rage beneath the composed exterior, that both frightened and fascinated her. "You're out of your mind," Jacob whispered that evening as they shared a meager supper in the servants' quarters. "Everyone's talking about how you look the prince in the eye like you were his equal." Melissa shrugged, tearing a piece of bread. "He's just a man. He's not just any man," hissed Anna, a kitchen maid. "They call him the Wolf Prince in the Northern Territories. I heard he once had a soldier flogged for falling asleep on watch. I also heard he stood between a village and attacking bandits with only 3 men beside him," countered Jacob. "Saved dozens of lives." "Stop gossiping," Melissa muttered, uncomfortable with the attention. Her mind was elsewhere, caught between the dreamlike revelations in Mrs. Johnson's box and the strange encounter with the prince. Later that night, alone in her attic room, Melissa removed the kerchief that concealed her hair. In the cracked mirror, long copper gold tresses spilled over her shoulders, hair much too fine for a stable girl. Mrs. Johnson had always warned her. By candlelight, she pulled out the hidden box and reread the letter penned in Mrs. Johnson's shaky hand. "My dearest child, by the time you read this, I will have joined the stars. I can no longer bear the burden of this secret. 15 years ago, I was not a cook at Westbrook, but a kitchen servant in the palace of Fairhaven. On the night King Maxwell's army breached our walls, I found you, a terrified child of 5, hiding in the royal nursery. Your name is not Melissa, but Scarlet, daughter of King Edward and Queen Isabella of Fairhaven. The royal mark upon your collarbone is proof enough, but I also managed to save these documents proving your lineage and your right to the throne. I have kept you hidden to save your life, but perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps you were meant for more than a servant's existence. The choice of what to do with this truth is now yours. With all my love, Emma Johnson." Tucked alongside the letter were royal birth records and a small medallion bearing the Fairhaven crest. Melissa, or Scarlet, ran her fingers over the intricate silver star, feeling a strange stirring of memory, like catching the tail end of a forgotten dream. She recalled fragments of a different life, soft beds with silk sheets, a woman with her same copper hair singing lullabies, a man with a deep laugh who would toss her into the air. Were these genuine memories or simply wishes shaped into false recollections? For the next week, Prince Thomas appeared in the stables daily. always requesting that Melissa tend to his horse. Each time, she felt his eyes studying her, as though trying to solve a puzzle. She maintained her composure, neither flinching from his gaze, nor showing the fear that other servants displayed one afternoon as she brushed Tempest's gleaming coat. Thomas spoke directly to her. "You're different from the others," he observed. "You don't cower." Melissa continued her methodical brushing. "Would you prefer that I did, Your Highness?" A sound escaped him, almost a laugh. "No, fear is useful for keeping order, but honesty is rarer and more valuable." She paused, risking a glance at him. "Then honestly, Your Highness, even kings and princes are mortal men. The blood that runs through your veins is the same color as mine." Instead of anger, his expression showed something like appreciation. "What's your name?" "Melissa, Your Highness." "Melissa," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. "You speak as though you've had an education." Her heart raced. "Mrs. Johnson, my guardian, taught me to read and write." She believed all people should know their letters, regardless of station. Thomas nodded slowly. A progressive view and unusual. He turned to leave, then paused. "Tell me, Melissa, do you believe in fate?" The question caught her off guard. "I'm not sure, Your Highness." "I didn't either," he said, his voice suddenly distant. "Until recently." As he walked away, Melissa couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just transpired, as though invisible threads of destiny were beginning to weave around them both. That night, lying on her thin pallet, she made a decision, whether she was truly Princess Scarlet or simply Melissa the stable girl. She would no longer hide in the shadows. For 15 years, she had kept her head down while the man who destroyed her homeland, who may have murdered her true parents, ruled with impunity. Mrs. Johnson had given her a choice. Now, she chose to find the truth, and perhaps justice. The great hall of Westbrook Palace buzzed with anticipation. Nobility from across the kingdom had gathered for the formal introduction of Princess Eleanor of Oakshire, who had arrived that morning with an entourage of 20 carriages and enough trunks to suggest she planned never to return home. Thomas stood beside his father's throne, jaw clenched as he observed the princess. She was conventionally beautiful with honey-blonde hair and delicate features, but her eyes held a calculating coldness that reminded him too much of the courtiers he'd grown to despise as she curtsied before the king. Her gaze darted briefly to Thomas, assessing him like a prize stallion at auction. "Our kingdoms will be stronger united," King Maxwell declared, raising his goblet. "A toast to the future bride and groom." The court erupted in cheers. Thomas raised his cup mechanically, his mind racing for 2 weeks. He had watched the court carefully, identifying potential allies and enemies. He'd reconnected with Lady Margaret, now serving as head lady in waiting, whose eyes still held the sadness they'd carried since his mother's death. He'd observed the Duke of Blackwood's growing influence and the way courtiers scrambled to curry favor with both the king and his ruthless enforcer. Most importantly, he'd continued his strange connection with the stable girl, Melissa. Each encounter left him increasingly certain she was no ordinary servant. There was something in her bearing, her speech, that spoke of hidden depths. An idea had taken root in Thomas's mind, a plan so audacious it might just succeed where a direct challenge would fail. "Your Majesty," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the celebratory chatter. "Before these arrangements progress further, I must speak with you privately." Maxwell's eyes narrowed, but he nodded curtly. "Very well. To my chambers." Once alone, the king's false courtesy evaporated. "Whatever objection you're about to raise, save it. This alliance will secure our eastern border." "I'm not marrying the princess," Thomas stated flatly. Maxwell's face darkened. "You forget yourself, boy. You'll do as commanded. I've already chosen a bride." The king laughed harshly. "Have you now? And who is this fortunate lady?" "She's not a lady," Thomas replied. "She's a stable servant named Melissa." The silence that followed was absolute. Maxwell stared as though his son had sprouted a second head. "You've lost your mind," he finally hissed. "Perhaps too many blows to the head in battle." "I'm perfectly sane," Thomas countered. "And I will marry her, with or without your blessing." "You expect me to allow the crown prince to marry a filthy stable girl?" Maxwell slammed his fist on the desk. "I'll have you locked in the tower before I permit such madness. Then you'll need to explain to our honored guests, including the Oakshire delegation, Why, the war hero they've come to celebrate has been imprisoned, Thomas said coolly. I wonder how that would affect your precious alliance. The king's eyes narrowed to slits. You dare threaten me? It's not a threat, but consider this. If you force this Oakshire marriage, I'll tell every kingdom within reach exactly how the great King Maxwell treats his own blood, how Queen Virginia really died, how you— Enough! Maxwell roared, his face purpling. Then, regaining control, he leaned forward. Marry your whore if you must, but know this, it will be a temporary arrangement. Once you've tired of her, we'll find a way to dissolve this farce. Thomas bowed stiffly. As you wish, father. In the stables, Melissa was brushing down the princess's mare when Master Fletcher burst in, his face ashen. Melissa, come quickly. The prince has summoned you to the royal chambers. Her heart lurched. What? Why? Don't ask questions, girl. When royalty calls you, run. Confused and alarmed, Melissa hastily wiped her hands on her apron and followed Fletcher through winding corridors until they reached an antechamber where Lady Margaret waited. Leave us, the older woman told Fletcher. When they were alone, she studied Melissa with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. The prince has made an unusual request. He wishes to speak with you directly. Have I done something wrong, my lady? That remains to be seen. Lady Margaret's gaze lingered on Melissa's neck, where the high collar of her rough dress concealed her birthmark. Come. Thomas paced before a large window when they entered. He turned sharply, and for the first time, Melissa saw something besides cold calculation in his eyes. Uncertainty. Leave us, Lady Margaret, he commanded, once the door closed. He gestured to a chair. Please sit. Melissa remained standing. I prefer to stand in the presence of royalty, Your Highness. A humorless smile crossed his face. You might reconsider that position after hearing what I have to say. He paused. I've informed my father that we are to be married. Melissa's knees nearly buckled. Your Highness must be joking. I assure you I'm deadly serious. But why me? She managed, mind reeling. Thomas crossed to a table and poured wine into 2 goblets. Because you're unlike anyone else in this court. Because my father and his sycophants will hate it. He offered her a cup. And because I suspect you have reasons of your own to want access to the royal family. Melissa's hand trembled as she took the goblet. I don't understand. Don't you? Thomas's gaze was piercing. I've watched you, Melissa. You carry yourself like royalty disguised as a servant. Not a servant pretending at dignity. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Could he know? Whatever game you're playing, he continued, it aligns with mine. I need a wife who isn't a political pawn. You need something from this court. Perhaps we can help each other. Melissa took a steadying breath. And if I refuse, you won't. There was cold certainty in his voice. Not if you want justice. The word struck her like lightning. Justice. The very thing she'd been quietly yearning for since reading Mrs. Johnson's letter. What would this marriage entail? She asked carefully. A year, he replied. Give me 1 year as my wife. Help me navigate the court in return. I'll grant you freedom and lands of your own afterward. No questions asked. And, she hesitated, your expectations of me as a wife. Understanding dawned in his eyes. This is a political arrangement, not a love match. Your virtue is safe with me. Relief washed through her, followed by wariness. When would this happen? Tomorrow, my father has insisted on a small private ceremony to minimize the scandal. His mouth quirked. He hopes to hide you away like a shameful secret. I intend to do the opposite. Melissa's mind raced. As Thomas's wife, even temporarily, she would have access to the palace records, to people who might remember Fairhaven, possibly even evidence of Maxwell's treachery. It was a chance she might never have again. I accept, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Thomas nodded as though he'd never doubted her answer. Lady Margaret will prepare you. The ceremony is at noon tomorrow. The wedding was a hushed affair in the palace chapel, with only essential witnesses present. Melissa wore a simple gown provided by Lady Margaret, who had spent the morning studying her with increasing disquiet. Your hair, the lady-in-waiting had murmured while arranging it. The color reminds me of... But she never finished the thought, as Melissa stood beside Prince Thomas before the royal chaplain. She felt the hostile stares of the courtiers. The king himself looked through her as though she were invisible, Only Thomas seemed calm, his face an unreadable mask as he spoke his vows. When it was done, there was no feast, no celebration. The king departed without a word, and the few nobles present dispersed quickly. Eager to spread gossip throughout the court, Lady Margaret escorted them to the prince's chambers. Now theirs, Melissa realized with a flutter of panic. At the threshold, Thomas dismissed the lady-in-waiting with a curt nod. Alone in the candlelit room, Melissa stood awkwardly by the door while Thomas poured himself a drink. "The hard part begins tomorrow," he said. "The court will be merciless." "I can handle their disdain," she replied. Thomas turned, really looking at her for the first time that day, without the dirt of the stables, with her copper gold hair elegantly arranged and the simple gown highlighting her slender figure. Melissa looked transformed. "Yes," he said slowly. "I believe you can." He crossed to a side table and removed a small key from his pocket. "This opens the door to the adjoining chamber. It will be your private room. I meant what I said. This is a marriage of convenience, nothing more," as he unlocked the door for her. His gaze caught on something, the edge of her birthmark, usually hidden but now partially visible in the neckline of her gown. His eyes narrowed. "What is that?" Melissa quickly adjusted her collar. "Just a birthmark, Your Highness." "Thomas," he corrected absently, his attention still fixed on what he'd glimpsed. "We're married now, however strange that may be." She nodded uncomfortably. "Thomas," he seemed about to press further, but instead stepped back. "Get some rest tomorrow. We begin our charade in earnest." As Melissa retreated to her new chamber, she wondered what she had gotten herself into, and whether the prince's plan for vengeance would help or hinder her own search for truth. The candle's flame cast dancing shadows across Melissa's new bedchamber, despite the luxury surrounding her. Silk sheets, tapestried walls, a polished oak wardrobe filled with hastily procured gowns. She felt more trapped than ever. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over Mrs. Johnson's wooden box. She had smuggled it from the stables, unwilling to leave her only proof of identity behind. A soft knock startled her. She quickly tucked the box under her pillow before calling, "Enter." Lady Margaret stepped inside, carrying a tray with bread, cheese, and wine. "I thought you might be hungry." "Your Highness," she said, the title sounding strange when addressing the former stable girl. "Thank you, but please, there's no need for such formality when we're alone," Melissa replied, gesturing for the older woman to sit. Lady Margaret placed the tray down but remained standing. "The court is in an uproar. The Oakshire delegation is threatening to leave. The king—" She hesitated. "The king is furious." "I imagine he would be," Melissa said quietly. "May I speak frankly, child?" When Melissa nodded, the lady-in-waiting continued. "Prince Thomas is not a man given to impulse or sentiment. This marriage serves some purpose in his larger design." Her eyes softened. "I worry for you, caught in whatever game he's playing." Melissa met her gaze steadily. "I entered this arrangement with open eyes, Lady Margaret." "Did you?" The older woman studied her face. "There's something about you. Something familiar I can't quite place." Her gaze dropped to Melissa's high collar. "That birthmark I glimpsed earlier." Melissa's hand instinctively rose to her neck. "It's nothing. Just a blemish I've had since birth." Lady Margaret stepped closer. "May I see it, please?" After a moment's hesitation, Melissa slowly lowered her collar, revealing the silver star pattern on her skin. Lady Margaret's sharp intake of breath confirmed her worst fears. "Sweet heavens," the woman whispered, her face paling. "The Fairhaven mark. I've only seen it once before, on Queen Isabella when I served briefly in her court before." She couldn't finish, staring at Melissa with new eyes. "Who are you really?" "Child?" Thomas paced his chamber, second-guessing his own strategy. Marrying a commoner, especially one he suspected harbored secrets of her own, was a calculated risk that could backfire spectacularly. Yet the look of pure rage on his father's face had been worth it, for the first time since returning to court. Thomas felt he had seized control of the game. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, expecting a servant instead. The Duke of Blackwood strode in, his tall frame imposing even without the ceremonial armor he typically wore. "Your Highness," the Duke bowed slightly, "the King requests your presence at tomorrow's council meeting. Despite today's unexpected events, state business continues." Thomas nodded curtly. "I'll be there." The Duke didn't leave, his cold eyes assessing the prince. Your father is concerned about your judgment. This marriage is my business, not his, Thomas cut in. Nor yours, Duke. Everything that affects the stability of the realm is my business, Blackwood replied, his voice dangerously soft. I've served your father loyally through 3 campaigns. I held your mother as she took her last breath. Thomas stiffened. Careful, Duke. I merely suggest, Blackwood continued, that you consider the consequences of your actions, this girl. Where did she come from? What do you really know about her? You're dismissed, Thomas said coldly. After the Duke left, Thomas moved to the window. Troubled, Blackwood's interest in Melissa was concerning. The Duke had been his father's executioner for years, the man who carried out the king's most brutal orders without question. If he was investigating Melissa, they would need to be more careful. So it's true, Lady Margaret whispered, sitting at last as her legs seemed to give way. You're Princess Scarlet of Fairhaven. Melissa nodded slowly, retrieving the wooden box from beneath her pillow. According to these documents and Mrs. Johnson's testimony, yes. She showed Lady Margaret the contents, the birth records bearing the royal seal of Fairhaven, the small medallion with the kingdom's crest, and finally, the letter Mrs. Johnson had left her. Emma Johnson, Lady Margaret murmured, tracing the signature. I remember her, King Edward's head cook. Everyone thought she perished in the fire. She looked up, eyes brimming with tears. We all believed no one from the royal family survived that night. King Maxwell made sure word spread that the entire bloodline was extinguished. Melissa swallowed hard. Then it's all true. I am Princess Scarlet. There's no doubt in my mind, Lady Margaret whispered. You have your mother's hair, your father's eyes. She paused. But there's more in this box than just proof of your lineage. She carefully removed a sealed letter tucked beneath the other documents. A letter Melissa hadn't noticed before. The wax seal bore the crest of Westbrook, but pressed into it was a smaller mark. A tiny dove. Queen Virginia's personal seal, Lady Margaret breathed. I'd recognize it anywhere. With trembling fingers, Melissa broke the seal and unfolded the yellowed parchment. The handwriting was elegant but hurried. To His Majesty, King Edward of Fairhaven, I write in great haste and greater fear. My husband plans to attack your kingdom within the fortnight. He believes you possess ancient maps to the mountain passages that would allow him to circumvent Oakshire's defenses. There is no honor in this planned assault, only bloodlust disguised as strategy. I have tried to dissuade him, but he grows increasingly paranoid and violent. I fear not only for your kingdom, but for my own safety and that of my son. Burn this letter after reading. If Maxwell discovers my warning, it will mean my death. In solemn friendship, Virginia, Queen of Westbrook. Melissa looked up, stunned. Thomas's mother tried to warn my parents. Lady Margaret nodded gravely, and paid for her loyalty with her life, or so we all believed. She took Melissa's hands in hers. Child, do you understand what this means? Maxwell didn't just conquer Fairhaven. He murdered his own wife for trying to prevent the attack. The door connecting to Thomas's chamber suddenly swung open. Both women froze as the prince stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the scattered documents between them. I think, he said quietly, you both have some explaining to do. The three sat in tense silence. After Melissa and Lady Margaret finished their account, Thomas stood by the window, his back to them, shoulders rigid as he processed the revelation that the stable girl he'd married on impulse was, in fact, the last surviving royal of a kingdom his father had destroyed. More shocking still was the letter from his mother, proof that his suspicions about her death had been correct all along. Let me understand this clearly, he finally said, turning to face them. My mother discovered my father's plans to attack Fairhaven. She warned your father. He nodded toward Melissa. For this act of conscience, my father had her poisoned. It appears so, Lady Margaret confirmed softly. Thomas's laugh was bitter. And now, by some twist of fate, I've married the very princess my father failed to eliminate 15 years ago. His eyes fixed on Melissa with new intensity. Did you know who I was when I proposed this arrangement? Was this your plan all along? No, Melissa stood, indignant. I had no idea about any of this until Mrs. Johnson died. I didn't even know who I truly was until a month ago. Thomas studied her face, searching for deception, finding none. He ran a hand through his hair. So we're both pawns who decided to play our own game, only to discover we're on the same side of the board. It seems fate has plans for you both, Lady Margaret observed. This cannot be mere coincidence. Thomas picked up his mother's letter, tracing the familiar handwriting. All these years, I've planned my revenge, never knowing the full extent of his treachery. His voice hardened. This changes everything, and nothing. He turned to Melissa, really seeing her now, not as the stable girl he'd married to spite his father, but as Princess Scarlet, rightful heir to the throne of Fairhaven. We have a common enemy, he said, and now, a common purpose. Justice, Melissa whispered. Thomas nodded slowly. Justice, for my mother, for your parents, for both our kingdoms. He glanced at Lady Margaret. Can we trust you with these secrets? The older woman straightened. I served your mother faithfully in life. I will honor her memory by helping you both now. Then we are allies, Thomas declared, extending his hand to Melissa. She hesitated only briefly before taking it. His grip was warm and firm, and for the first time since entering this strange arrangement, Melissa felt something beyond fear and calculation, a spark of hope. Allies, she agreed. But remember, Prince Thomas, justice and vengeance are not the same. I want the truth revealed, not simply more bloodshed. Their eyes locked in silent understanding. Two people brought together by tragedy, now bound by purpose stronger than the marriage vows they'd exchanged hours before. Neither noticed Lady Margaret's slight smile as she watched them, nor heard her whispered words. Virginia would be pleased. Morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the royal dining hall, casting colorful patterns across the gleaming table where Thomas sat with his father and the Duke of Blackwood. Melissa had been conveniently forgotten in the breakfast invitation, a slight that Thomas noted with cold amusement. His father's petty attempts to minimize his new daughter-in-law only strengthened his resolve. The Oakshire delegation leaves today, King Maxwell announced, cutting into his pheasant. Princess Eleanor was most displeased. Send my apologies, Thomas replied blandly, raising his goblet. Though I'm sure another alliance will present itself. The king's knuckles whitened around his knife. You've created quite the spectacle, Thomas. The court speaks of nothing else. Good, let them talk. Maxwell leaned forward. What game are you playing, boy? This marriage is beneath you, beneath our bloodline. Thomas met his father's gaze evenly. Perhaps I simply preferred to choose my own bride, rather than accept your political arrangement. A stable girl? The king scoffed. What next? Will you invite the royal pigkeeper to council meetings? The Duke of Blackwood cleared his throat. Speaking of which, Your Majesty, we have reports of increased Northland activity along our borders. Their ships have been spotted with concerning frequency. The conversation shifted to military matters, but Thomas caught the calculating glance Blackwood sent his way. The Duke had been watching him closely since the wedding, his interest in Melissa particularly troubling. We should increase patrols along the coast, Thomas suggested, forcing himself to focus. Playing the dutiful son and military strategist was part of his masquerade. As the meeting concluded, King Maxwell gestured for Thomas to remain, once they were alone. The king's false civility vanished. You will present your wife at court tonight, he ordered. If you insist on this farce, she will be displayed properly, not hidden away like some shameful secret. Let the court see your folly in full view. Thomas smiled thinly. As you wish, father. I'm sure Melissa will make quite the impression. Stand still. Your Highness, the seamstress muttered around a mouthful of pins as she adjusted Melissa's gown. I've told you, please call me Melissa, she replied, trying not to fidget as 3 handmaidens, assigned by Lady Margaret, fussed over her appearance. Nonsense, Lady Margaret said from her seat by the window. You are a princess twice over now, by birth and by marriage. The sooner you embrace that identity, the better. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of instruction. Lady Margaret, seemingly rejuvenated by their shared secret, had taken it upon herself to transform Melissa from stable girl to royal consort with ruthless efficiency. Back straight, chin slightly raised, she instructed. A true royal never slouches, even when alone. Melissa sighed. I spent 15 years shoveling hay and grooming horses. Proper posture wasn't exactly a priority, and yet you've maintained a dignity that belies your upbringing. Lady Margaret observed. Your mother was the same way. Queen Isabella could command a room without saying a word. These small glimpses into her true parentage were precious to Melissa, who had no memories of her mother beyond vague impressions of warmth and a melodic voice. The door opened, and Thomas entered, pausing momentarily at the sight of Melissa in her half-pinned emerald gown. Something flickered in his eyes before his expression returned to its usual guarded neutrality. My father expects us at court tonight, he announced. He believes parading you before the nobility will embarrass us both. Lady Margaret snorted. How little he knows. Indeed, Thomas agreed, the hint of a smile touching his lips. Melissa, are you prepared for this? She met his gaze steadily. I am. In truth, the thought of facing the entire court terrified her, but she wouldn't give him or the king the satisfaction of seeing her fear. These past days had taught her that vulnerability was a luxury she could no longer afford. After the seamstress and handmaidens departed, Thomas closed the door behind them. We need to discuss strategy, he said, pacing the room. The court will be watching our every move, listening to every word. Some support my defiance of the king, others despise me for it. All are curious about you. What would you have me do? Melissa asked. Be exactly what they don't expect. Poised, intelligent, worthy of your position. He paused. We can use their underestimation to our advantage, while you continue your investigations. Thomas nodded. Since discovering their shared connection, he had been systematically gathering information, speaking with veterans of the Fairhaven campaign, reviewing historical records, rekindling old military friendships. Each night, they compared notes in careful whispers, piecing together the truth of what happened 15 years ago. Captain Wilson arrives tomorrow, he told her. He served in the Northern Campaign with me but was previously stationed at Fairhaven's border. He may have valuable insights. Can he be trusted? As much as anyone can be in this nest of vipers. Thomas's expression darkened. Blackwood concerns me. He's been asking questions about you. Your background, how long you've worked in the stables. Melissa felt a chill. Has he discovered anything? Not yet, but we must be cautious. He approached her, his voice lowering. Tonight, follow my lead. Let them see us as a united front, however unusual our pairing might seem. She nodded, suddenly aware of his proximity. In their shared chambers, each night, they maintained a careful distance, their alliance formal, their interactions proper. Yet sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite define. I won't disappoint you, she promised. Something shifted in his gaze. This isn't about disappointing me, Melissa. It's about survival. Yours, mine, yours. And the truth we both seek. The great hall sparkled with hundreds of candles as nobles in their finest attire mingled and gossiped. Conversation faltered as Thomas and Melissa entered, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore the emerald gown completed with silver thread, her copper gold hair arranged in an elegant style that highlighted her delicate features. The stable dirt and rough clothing had concealed a natural beauty that now shone like a newly polished gem. Breathe, Thomas murmured, as they approached the dais where King Maxwell sat, his expression thunderous. Your Majesty, Thomas bowed, while Melissa executed a perfect curtsy that Lady Margaret had drilled into her for hours. So this is the bride who replaced a princess, the king said loudly enough for nearby courtiers to hear. Let's hope she proves worth the diplomatic incident her presence has caused. I shall endeavor to serve Westbrook with dignity and loyalty, Your Majesty, Melissa replied, her voice clear and unwavering. Maxwell's eyes narrowed at her articulate response, clearly having expected a stammering, intimidated servant. We shall see. Throughout the evening, Melissa felt the weight of curious stares and heard the whispered comments behind jeweled fans. Some nobles approached with transparent insincerity. Others kept their distance as though her common origins might be contagious. The Countess of Hawthorne, a striking woman with raven hair and sharp eyes, seemed particularly interested in the new princess. Such a unusual match, she purred, circling Melissa like a predator. One wonders what special qualities caught our prince's discerning eye. Perhaps he values authenticity over artifice, Melissa replied with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. The Countess's face hardened momentarily before she laughed, a brittle sound. Charming, though I'd be careful with that tongue, my dear. The court has little patience for upstarts, however, authentic they may be. As she glided away, Thomas appeared at Melissa's side, a goblet of wine in each hand. "I see you've met the Countess. She doesn't seem to approve of me. She doesn't approve of anyone who threatens her influence. She's been my father's companion for years." Melissa accepted the wine, careful not to show her disgust. "The same woman who testified falsely against your mother. The very same." Thomas's eyes followed the Countess across the room. "She knows more than she's ever revealed. Someday she'll answer for that." As the evening progressed, Melissa found herself in conversation with various nobles, some genuinely curious about the woman who had captured the prince's interest, others hoping to catch her in some embarrassing faux pas. To their disappointment, she navigated the discussions with unexpected grace. "You're a natural," Thomas observed as they shared a brief moment alone between introductions. "They're bewildered by you." "Good," Melissa replied. "Confusion makes people careless." His eyebrow rose slightly, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "Indeed it does." For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that they were more alike than either had initially realized. Then the moment broke as another noble approached, and the performance continued. By the time they returned to their chambers that night, Melissa was exhausted but triumphant. She had survived her first court appearance without disgracing herself or their cause. "You did well," Thomas acknowledged as Lady Margaret helped Melissa out of her elaborate gown. "My father expected a spectacle. Instead, he got a princess." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on any of them. Once alone, Melissa stood by the window, watching moonlight spill across the palace gardens. The court's judgmental stares had been difficult, yet somehow less intimidating than she'd feared. Perhaps because she now understood her own worth in a way she never had before. She wasn't just playing a role. She was reclaiming a heritage that had been stolen from her. Every poised step and carefully chosen word, a small victory against those who had destroyed her family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new deceptions. But tonight, for the first time since discovering her true identity, Melissa felt the stirring of something powerful within her. Not just the desire for justice, but the determination to become the princess she was born to be. A week had passed since Melissa's debut at court, and despite initial resistance, the palace had settled into an uneasy acceptance of the prince's unusual bride. What began as a scandal had transformed into a peculiar fascination as nobles observed her unexpected poise and intelligence. Some even began to court her favor, sensing that Thomas's defiance of his father might signal a future shift in power. Captain Wilson had arrived as promised, a gruff, battle-weathered man with shrewd eyes and a loyalty to Thomas that transcended his oath to the crown. Melissa had watched from the window as Thomas greeted him in the courtyard with the closest thing to genuine warmth she'd seen from the prince. "He was kind to me when others weren't," Thomas explained later. "Taught me to survive not just battle, but court politics as well." Tonight, the royal family would host the Midsummer Ball, an annual tradition that brought together nobility from across the kingdom. For Melissa, it represented an even greater challenge than her first court appearance, a formal event requiring her to dance, converse, and comport herself as a true royal for hours under intense scrutiny. "Stand still," Lady Margaret instructed as she fastened tiny sapphires into Melissa's elaborately arranged hair. "These belong to Queen Virginia. Thomas requested you wear them tonight." Melissa touched one of the glittering stones. "They're beautiful, but won't the king recognize them?" "That's precisely the point, my dear. Thomas wants to send a message." The gown selected for the occasion was equally significant. Silver blue silk that shimmered like moonlight on water, with delicate embroidery reminiscent of Fairhaven's royal crest worked subtly into the bodice. To most observers, it would appear merely decorative, but those familiar with the fallen kingdom might recognize the pattern. "It's a dangerous game you play," Lady Margaret warned as she made final adjustments. "The king is already suspicious of your influence over Thomas." "It's not influence," Melissa protested. "We're allies, nothing more." Lady Margaret's knowing smile suggested she believed otherwise. "Is that why you watch him when you think no one is looking? Why he finds reasons to be near you even when appearances don't demand it?" Heat rose to Melissa's cheeks. "We share a common purpose, that's all." "If you say so." "My dear," Lady Margaret stepped back to assess her work. "There, A true princess of Fairhaven. Melissa turned to the mirror and barely recognized herself. Gone was any trace of the stable girl. In her place stood a regal young woman whose bearing suggested she had been born to nobility. The transformation was so complete it startled her. "Remember what I taught you about the traditional dances," Lady Margaret said, gathering her things. "The spiral waltz will be particularly important. It's a court favorite." Melissa's stomach tightened. "I've never danced it before." "Yes, you have," Lady Margaret replied cryptically. "Your body will remember what your mind has forgotten." The royal ballroom, used only for the grandest occasions, took Melissa's breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors, while massive arched windows revealed star-filled skies. Garlands of summer flowers and silver ribbons adorned pillars and balustrades, their sweet scent mingling with perfume and beeswax candles. Thomas awaited her at the entrance, resplendent in formal attire of midnight blue with silver accents that complemented her gown. His eyes widened slightly as she approached, a reaction so subtle only someone watching closely would notice. "You look," he began, then seemed to reconsider his words. "The sapphires suit you. Thank you for lending them," she replied softly. Something unspoken passed between them before he offered his arm. "Ready?" She nodded, placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. "As I'll ever be." They entered together, heads turning as the herald announced their arrival. King Maxwell, already seated on a raised dais, watched them with narrowed eyes, particularly noting the sapphires adorning Melissa's hair. The first hours passed in a blur of introductions and careful conversation. Melissa found herself growing more confident with each successful interaction. Drawing on Lady Margaret's intensive coaching and her own developing instincts, Thomas remained close, his hand occasionally brushing the small of her back in a gesture that appeared possessive to observers, but served primarily to guide and support her when the musicians began tuning their instruments for the formal dances. Nervous anticipation fluttered in Melissa's chest. Court dances were intricate affairs with specific steps and patterns that noble children learned from infancy. "Don't worry," Thomas murmured as he led her to the center of the floor for the opening dance. "Follow my lead." The music began, a stately pavane that required precise movement and timing. Melissa focused on Thomas's guidance, counting steps in her head. To her surprise, the movements felt strangely familiar, as though her body indeed remembered what her mind did not. With each successful turn and step, her confidence grew. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the Duke of Blackwood watching intently, his gaze calculating as he whispered something to the king. Thomas noticed as well, his grip tightening slightly on her hand. "Blackwood suspects something," he said under his breath. "Be careful." As the evening progressed, Melissa danced with various nobles as protocol demanded, though she returned to Thomas for the most important dances. Despite her initial fears, she moved with a natural grace that belied her supposed common upbringing, a fact not lost on the more observant courtiers. "She dances like she was born to it," a duchess whispered loudly enough to be overheard. "Perhaps our prince knows something we don't," her companion replied with a meaningful glance. Finally, the musicians announced the spiral waltz, an ancient dance originated in Fairhaven, but adopted by Westbrook after the conquest. Couples formed a large circle, moving in intricate patterns that gradually spiraled inward, symbolizing the turning of seasons and the passage of time. "This is your moment," Thomas told her as they took their positions. "Trust yourself," the music began, hauntingly familiar strings and woodwinds playing a melody that stirred something deep in Melissa's memory. As they began to move, the years seemed to fall away. Suddenly she was 5 years old again, watching her parents dance this very pattern during a festival, her small feet mimicking their steps on the sidelines. Without conscious thought, Melissa's body remembered. She moved with perfect precision, her steps exactly matching the traditional Fairhaven style, rather than the slightly modified Westbrook version. Thomas followed her lead, adapting seamlessly to her movements. As they spiraled toward the center of the floor, other dancers faltered and stopped to watch. Even the musicians seemed entranced, the lead violinist unconsciously shifting to the pure Fairhaven arrangement of the melody. "Where did you learn to dance like that?" Thomas asked, genuine wonder in his voice. "I don't know," she answered truthfully. "It just came back to me." As the dance concluded, the ballroom erupted in applause. all except for the king and the Duke of Blackwood, whose expressions had darkened considerably. The Duke leaned toward Maxwell, whispering urgently in his ear. Thomas immediately guided Melissa away from the center of attention. "We've revealed too much," he murmured. "Blackwood knows the Fairhaven version of the dance. He's realized something's amiss." Before she could respond, an elderly woman with rheumy eyes and trembling hands approached them, her lined face alight with emotion. "Forgive an old woman's intrusion," she said in a quavering voice. "But I was lady-in-waiting to Queen Isabella of Fairhaven before the fall." She looked at Melissa with tears gathering in her eyes. "You dance exactly as she did, my dear. For a moment, I thought time itself had turned backward." Thomas smoothly intervened, steering the emotional woman away with practiced charm. "Your kind words honor my wife, Lady Beatrice. Perhaps you'd enjoy some refreshment. Allow me to escort you." As he led the old woman away, Melissa caught the Duke of Blackwood watching her with renewed intensity. A chill ran down her spine. They had indeed revealed too much later, as the ball began to wind down. Thomas pulled her into a quiet alcove, his expression grave. "Blackwood is leaving the ball early. He's up to something. What should we do?" Melissa asked, fighting to maintain her composed facade while panic rose within. Thomas's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw genuine concern there, not just for their plans, but for her. "We need to accelerate our timeline," he said. "Captain Wilson has discovered something. Documents in the military archives that were supposed to be destroyed. We're meeting him tomorrow." Melissa nodded, acutely aware of Thomas's proximity in the small alcove. The night's dancing had broken down some invisible barrier between them. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that appeared when he was concerned. "You were magnificent tonight," he said suddenly, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I've never seen anyone dance the spiral waltz with such perfection." "Thomas," she began, uncertain what to say. Before either could speak further, King Maxwell's voice boomed across the ballroom, calling for the final toast of the evening. The moment shattered, and reality rushed back in. "Remember," Thomas whispered as they rejoined the gathering, "no matter what happens, we're in this together now," as they raised their goblets for the toast. Their eyes met over the crystal rims. Two people drawn together by fate and vengeance, now connected by something neither had anticipated. Across the room, the Duke of Blackwood watched them like a predator sizing up prey. His eyes cold with calculation and growing certainty. The dance of truth had begun, and there would be no turning back. Gray clouds hung low over Westbrook Palace as Melissa paced the confines of her chamber. Captain Wilson was already an hour late for their planned meeting. Thomas had left at dawn for an unexpected council session convened by the king, a transparent attempt to separate them after last night's revealing dance. A soft knock at the door startled her. Lady Margaret slipped inside, her face ashen. "We've been betrayed," she whispered. "The Duke of Blackwood has arrested Captain Wilson. They're interrogating him in the North Tower." Melissa's blood ran cold. "Does Thomas know?" "I've sent word, but the council meeting may be a deliberate distraction." Lady Margaret clutched Melissa's hands. "You must prepare to leave. The Duke has been gathering evidence. Wilson's arrest is just the beginning." "I won't flee without Thomas," Melissa insisted. "There may be no choice," Lady Margaret replied grimly. "Blackwood has found a witness, an old servant from Fairhaven who recognized your birthmark. He's presenting his findings to the king tonight." The reality of their situation crashed down on Melissa. All the careful planning, the cautious alliance building, had been for nothing. Blackwood had outmaneuvered them. "What do we do?" Lady Margaret pulled a small key from her sleeve. "This opens a passage behind the library's east bookcase. It leads to the old temple ruins beyond the castle walls." She pressed the key into Melissa's palm. "Pack only essentials. I'll gather what supplies I can and meet you there at nightfall. And Thomas, I'll get word to him. But you must be ready to leave with or without him." Lady Margaret's voice softened. "He wouldn't want you captured, child." After the lady-in-waiting departed, Melissa moved with practiced efficiency, selecting practical garments and boots she had insisted on keeping despite the court's preference for impractical finery. She wrapped the Fairhaven documents securely, along with a small dagger Thomas had given her for protection. A commotion in the corridor froze her mid-motion. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by the telltale clink of armored guards. By order of the king, search the prince's quarters." The Duke of Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the wooden door. Melissa's heart pounded as she grabbed her half-packed bundle and ducked behind a heavy tapestry depicting a hunting scene. A concealed door, one Thomas had shown her during their first week of marriage, lay beneath her trembling fingers. The main door burst open as she slipped into the narrow passage, pulling the hidden door closed just as guards swarmed into the chamber. Through the thin wall, she heard Blackwood's cold voice directing the search. "Find any documents mentioning Fairhaven, and bring the girl to the king when you find her." Melissa navigated the dark, dusty passage by memory, emerging in an unused storage room 3 corridors away. Servants scurried about in unusual numbers, whispers of arrests and traitors following in their wake. She kept her head down, clutching her bundle like a laundry maid as she made her way toward the library. The normally quiet library bustled with activity, scribes copying documents under the watchful eye of the king's secretary. Melissa retreated, knowing she couldn't reach the secret passage unnoticed. She would need another route, but every exit would be watched. A familiar figure rounded the corner. James, the stable boy who had worked alongside her for years. Relief flooded her until she noticed his grim expression, and the guards following just behind him. "That's her," he called, pointing directly at Melissa. "The prince's wife." She was heading toward the south wing. For one terrible moment, Melissa thought herself caught. Then she realized James was pointing beyond her, deliberately misleading the guards as they rushed past. He gave her an almost imperceptible nod. Melissa slipped in the opposite direction. Silently thanking James for his loyalty, she navigated through servants' corridors and rarely used stairwells, making her way toward the kitchens. If she couldn't reach the library passage, perhaps she could exit through the delivery entrance. The dinner preparations were in full swing, providing excellent cover as she wove between busy cooks and scullery maids. She was nearly at the delivery door when a hand clamped over her mouth, pulling her into a dark pantry. She fought wildly until a familiar voice whispered, "Stop struggling, it's me." Thomas released her, his face tense with urgency. His formal council attire was gone, replaced by a simple tunic and riding breeches. A thin cut across his cheekbone oozed blood. "What happened?" she gasped. "Blackwood made his move earlier than expected. He convinced my father I'm conspiring with Northland against the crown." Thomas's laugh was bitter. "Apparently, marrying you was part of my masterful plot to destabilize the kingdom. Wilson's been arrested." "I know. There's no saving him now." Thomas's expression hardened. "We have minutes at most before they lock down the entire palace. Lady Margaret is waiting with horses at the east postern gate. How did you find me?" "I know you better than you think, Melissa of the stables." Something like affection flickered across his face. "Or should I say, Princess Scarlet of Fairhaven?" Before she could respond, shouts echoed from the kitchen. The guards had changed direction. They slipped out the back of the pantry, through the herb garden, and along the narrow space between the kitchen wall and the inner bailey. Thomas led with confidence, clearly having mapped this escape route long ago. "You planned for this," Melissa realized. "I've planned for every contingency since returning to court," he replied without slowing, "including betrayal." The eastern postern gate was small and rarely used, partially concealed by overgrown ivy. Lady Margaret waited in the shadows. Holding the reins of 2 saddled horses, her usually impeccable appearance was gone, replaced by practical traveling clothes. "Quickly," she urged. "The changing of the guard is our only window." As Thomas helped Melissa mount, alarm bells began to ring throughout the palace. "They've discovered your absence," Lady Margaret said grimly. "You must ride for the mountains. I've marked a safe path on this map." She handed Thomas a rolled parchment. "A woodcutter's cabin 3 leagues north of Silvermere Lake. You'll be safe there while you gather allies." "Come with us," Melissa pleaded. Lady Margaret shook her head. "I can serve you better here, feeding false information to Blackwood. Now go." Thomas leaned down from his mount, clasping the older woman's hand. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." As they urged their horses through the gate and into the dim forest beyond, Melissa fought back tears. Everything was happening too quickly. The careful game of appearances shattered in an instant. They rode hard through the gathering dusk, keeping to game trails and shallow streams to confound tracking hounds. The distant sounds of pursuit drove them deeper into the dense forest. Thomas led with grim determination, occasionally glancing back to ensure Melissa kept pace, an hour into their flight. As they paused briefly to rest the horses, a distant horn sounded. "The hunting call," Thomas explained tersely. "They've picked up our trail." They pressed on, but Thomas's mount began to falter. Its breathing labored. "Something's wrong," Melissa called. "Your horse is struggling." Thomas dismounted, examining the animal with practiced hands. "Poison," he growled. "Slow acting. Administered before we escaped. Blackwood leaves nothing to chance." The horse collapsed, trembling violently. Thomas murmured gentle words as he put the suffering animal out of its misery with a swift, merciful cut. "We continue on foot," he decided, gathering essential supplies from the saddlebags. "Your horse can carry our provisions, but not both of us." They pressed on through increasingly difficult terrain, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. As the forest gave way to rockier ground at the mountain's edge, an arrow whistled past, missing Melissa's head by inches. "Run!" Thomas shouted, drawing his sword. They sprinted toward a narrow ravine, Melissa leading the horse while Thomas guarded their rear. More arrows flew, one striking the horse, which reared in pain, throwing their supplies to the ground. Another arrow found its mark in Thomas's shoulder. He staggered but kept moving. "Leave the horse," he ordered through gritted teeth. "Take what you can carry." Melissa grabbed their most essential items as the injured horse bolted back toward their pursuers. They scrambled into the ravine, following the course of a swift stream that ran between steep rock walls. The water would hide their scent from tracking hounds. But Thomas was leaving a trail of blood despite his attempts to staunch the wound. "You're hurt badly," Melissa said as they paused in the shelter of an overhanging rock. "It's nothing," he lied, face pale with pain. "Let me see." She examined the wound with gentle fingers. The arrow had gone clean through his shoulder, but the shaft remained, preventing the worst of the bleeding. "We need to remove this and bind the wound properly." "No time," Thomas insisted. "They're too close," as if confirming his words. Voices echoed from further down the ravine. The king's men were closing in. Thomas made a swift decision. "There's a fork ahead. The right path leads higher into the mountains, harder to follow, but more exposed. The left goes through a series of caves that eventually connect to the valley beyond. Take the cave route. I'll take the right fork and draw them away." "No," Melissa protested. "You're injured. You won't make it alone." "This isn't a debate," Thomas said firmly. "One of us needs to survive to expose the truth. You're the rightful heir to Fairhaven. Your survival matters more." "And you," she demanded. "What about your vengeance?" His eyes softened unexpectedly. "This stopped being about vengeance the moment I found you." He reached out, his blood-stained fingers gently touching her cheek. "Find allies, rebuild, survive." Before she could argue further, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss both tender and desperate, filled with everything they hadn't had time to say. "Now go," he ordered, pulling away. "That's not a request." "Princess," fighting tears, Melissa backed away. "I'll find you," she promised. "This isn't over." Thomas's smile was grim. "No, it's just beginning." She turned and fled down the left fork of the ravine, the sound of Thomas's deliberate, noisy progress up the right path echoing behind her. Only when she was deep in the darkness of the caves did she allow herself a moment of grief, tears streaming down her face as she prayed to whatever gods might listen that the man she had come to love against all odds would somehow survive. Darkness surrounded Melissa as she navigated the winding cave system. Only a small lantern from her pack illuminated the treacherous path, casting eerie shadows on the damp stone walls. The sounds of pursuit had faded hours ago, but fear still propelled her forward. Her thoughts repeatedly returned to Thomas, his blood-stained face, his unexpected kiss, the sacrifice he'd made to ensure her escape. 3 days had passed since she'd emerged from the caves into a remote valley beyond the king's most frequented hunting grounds. Following Lady Margaret's map, she had traveled cautiously, avoiding settlements and keeping to the forests. Her fine clothes were now mud-stained and torn, her hands blistered from unfamiliar labor. The princess who had danced so elegantly at the midsummer ball was gone, replaced by a bedraggled fugitive fighting for survival. As the sun began to set on the 3rd day, Melissa finally spotted what she'd been searching for, a thin wisp of smoke rising above the trees near the small lake marked on her map, the woodcutter's cabin. Approaching cautiously, she circled the perimeter, checking for signs of a trap. The modest structure stood alone in a small clearing, its stone chimney puffing steady smoke that suggested occupation. With her dagger drawn, Melissa crept to a window and peered inside. An old man sat whittling by the fire, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision. No guards, no soldiers, just a solitary figure whose appearance matched Lady Margaret's description of their contact. She knocked 3 times, paused, then twice more, the signal they had arranged. The door opened to reveal the woodcutter, his rheumy eyes assessing her critically. "You're alone," he stated, voice gravelly from disuse. "My companion was injured covering my escape," she explained, fighting to keep her voice steady. The old man nodded grimly. "Lady Margaret's message mentioned there might be 2 of you." He stepped aside. "Come in, princess. These woods aren't safe after dark." The cabin's interior was simple but clean, with bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters and a pot of stew simmering over the fire. Melissa sank gratefully onto a rough-hewn bench, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. "My name is Garrett," the woodcutter said, ladling stew into a wooden bowl. "I served as head gamekeeper to King Edward of Fairhaven before the fall." Melissa's head snapped up. "You knew my father." "Aye. And you too, though you were just a wee thing then. You've your mother's look about you." He handed her the bowl. "Lady Margaret's message said you're in grave danger." Between mouthfuls of the hearty stew, Melissa explained their discovery, the dance that had revealed too much, and their desperate escape. "I don't know if Thomas survived," she finished, her voice breaking, "or what's happened to Lady Margaret and Captain Wilson." Garrett's face darkened. "King Maxwell's men have been scouring the forests for days. The official proclamation names you both as traitors conspiring with foreign powers." "It's a lie," Melissa said bitterly. "Of course it is. It's what Maxwell does. Twists truth until it serves him." Garrett poked at the fire. "But his lies are losing their power. Many remember Fairhaven fondly, especially in these outer regions. Rumors of your survival have stirred old loyalties." Hope flickered within her. "Are there enough who would support a challenge to Maxwell's rule? Perhaps, with proper leadership and proof of your identity." Garrett studied her thoughtfully. "But you'll need more than birthright to overthrow a king." A sudden knock at the door. 3 quick raps, a pause, 2 more, made them both tense. "Stay hidden," Garrett whispered, grabbing his woodcutting axe before approaching the door. Melissa darted behind a large storage chest, dagger ready. Had they been discovered already? The woodcutter opened the door a crack, then immediately stepped back in surprise. 2 cloaked figures entered quickly, one supporting the other, who moved with obvious difficulty. "Lady Margaret?" Melissa gasped. Emerging from her hiding place, the lady-in-waiting pushed back her hood, revealing her exhausted face. "Thank the gods you made it safely." She helped her companion to a chair by the fire. Melissa rushed forward, her heart racing with hope. "Thomas?" But as the second figure's cloak fell away, it revealed not Thomas but an older woman with silver-streaked golden hair and hollow cheeks. Despite her frail appearance, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. "Who?" Melissa began, then froze as recognition dawned. The woman's eyes, the same ice blue as Thomas's, regarded her with tired kindness. "This is Queen Virginia of Westbrook," Lady Margaret announced. "Thomas's mother." The room spun around Melissa. "But she's dead, poisoned 15 years ago. That's what Maxwell wanted everyone to believe," Lady Margaret explained, helping the Queen to a more comfortable position. "In truth, she survived the poisoning, though barely. Maxwell had her imprisoned in a secret chamber beneath the North Tower, telling the court she had died of a sudden illness." Queen Virginia's voice was soft but clear. "He couldn't risk executing me publicly. Too many foreign alliances depended on my family connections, so he created a living grave instead." "How did you escape?" Melissa asked, still struggling to process this revelation. "Lady Margaret discovered me years ago while delivering supplies to the Tower dungeons," Virginia explained. "She's been keeping me alive since, waiting for the right moment. When the Duke arrested Captain Wilson, I knew our conspiracy was exposed." Lady Margaret continued. "I realized we might never have a better opportunity. During the chaos of your escape, the guards assigned to the Queen's secret chamber were redeployed to the search. I took the chance to free her." Garrett shook his head in wonder. 15 years a prisoner. Maxwell's cruelty knows no bounds. "Where is my son?" Queen Virginia asked, looking around the cabin with increasing alarm. "Lady Margaret said he escaped with you." Melissa's throat tightened. "He was wounded covering my escape. He led the king's men away so I could reach safety." She couldn't bring herself to voice her deepest fear, that Thomas might already be dead. "He's alive," Queen Virginia stated with quiet certainty. "I would know if he weren't. A mother senses these things." "We need to find him," Melissa insisted. "He's injured, hunted, and trained in woodland survival since childhood." Lady Margaret interjected gently. "Thomas knows these mountains better than most of the king's men, if anyone can evade capture." "It's him. Lady Margaret is right," Queen Virginia said. "My son is resourceful. Our priority now must be gathering allies and evidence against Maxwell." The Queen's pragmatism, even concerning her own son's safety, struck Melissa. Despite years of imprisonment, Virginia's mind remained sharp. Focused on the larger goal, Melissa recognized the source of Thomas's strategic thinking. "Tell me, child," Virginia said, studying Melissa with penetrating eyes. "What exactly is your relationship with my son? Lady Margaret has explained who you are, but not how you came to marry Thomas." Melissa hesitated, uncertain how to describe their complicated arrangement. "It began as mutual convenience," she admitted. "He married me to upset his father's plans. I accepted to gain access to information about my family's destruction. But now there's more," Virginia finished for her, a knowing smile softening her gaunt features. "I see it in your eyes when you speak his name." Melissa didn't deny it. Somewhere between strategic alliance and desperate escape, her feelings for Thomas had transformed into something deeper and more frightening than she'd ever anticipated. "You might be exactly what he needs," the Queen continued. "Thomas was always a serious child, even before my supposed death, too much like his father in his determination. Though his heart remained true, he needs someone who reminds him there's more to life than vengeance. If he's still alive," Melissa whispered. Queen Virginia reached out, taking Melissa's hand in her frail one. "Have faith, Scarlet of Fairhaven. Our story isn't over yet." As the night deepened, they gathered around Garrett's table, plotting their next moves. The Queen, despite her weakened state, contributed valuable insights about the court's factions and potential allies. Lady Margaret reported which nobles had seemed sympathetic to Thomas before the escape. Garrett offered his knowledge of local sentiment and hidden paths through the kingdom. "We need proof of Maxwell's treachery that even his most loyal supporters can't ignore," Lady Margaret stressed. "Something beyond our testimony, which could be dismissed as the words of traitors." "The original battle plans for the Fairhaven invasion," Queen Virginia suggested. "Maxwell keeps them in a hidden compartment in his war room, his trophy from his greatest conquest. And we need Thomas," Melissa added firmly. "He's the rightful heir to Westbrook. Without him, even with proof of Maxwell's crimes, we risk civil war." As dawn approached, they had formed the outline of a plan, risky but with potential to succeed. While the others prepared for sleep, Melissa stepped outside, needing a moment alone. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, stars fading against the approaching day. Somewhere out there, Thomas was either fighting for his life or already lost to her. The thought made her chest ache with a pain that surprised her in its intensity. She hadn't expected to care this deeply, hadn't planned for the way his rare smiles made her heart race, or how his steadfast determination had earned her respect. And eventually her heart, their marriage had begun as strategic alliance and transformed into something neither had anticipated. "Find your way back to us. Thomas," she whispered to the fading stars. "We have a kingdom to reclaim, and a future to discover." A soft touch on her shoulder startled her. Queen Virginia had followed her outside, wrapping a shawl around her thin shoulders against the pre-dawn chill. "He will return," the Queen said with quiet assurance. "And when he does, he'll need your strength as much as your love." Together, they watched the sunrise, the exiled princess and the resurrected queen, bound by their love for the same man and their determination to see justice done, no matter the cost. 2 weeks had passed since their escape, with no word of Thomas. Melissa divided her days between caring for Queen Virginia, whose health gradually improved with proper food and fresh air, and training with Garrett, who taught her woodland survival and basic swordplay. A princess should know how to defend herself, he insisted, correcting her grip on a short blade, especially one planning to reclaim her throne. Their small band had grown. Lady Margaret's network proved invaluable, bringing 3 noble families loyal to Thomas's cause, and a dozen soldiers who had served under Captain Wilson. Most surprising was the arrival of Jacob, Melissa's fellow stable hand, who had risked everything to bring intelligence from the palace. "The king's gone half mad with rage," Jacob reported, warming his hands by the fire in their new camp, a well-hidden clearing deeper in the mountains. "He's accused half the court of conspiracy. The Duke of Blackwood is the only one he trusts now." "And Thomas?" Melissa asked. The question she always asked first. Jacob shook his head. "No word. Some say he's dead, but the king keeps sending search parties, so he must believe otherwise." "What of Captain Wilson?" Lady Margaret inquired. Jacob's face darkened. "Public execution 3 days ago. He revealed nothing, even under torture." Silence fell over the group, each honoring the captain's sacrifice in their own way. Melissa slipped away from the campfire, needing solitude to process her grief and fear. The trees provided some comfort, their ancient presence a reminder that kingdoms and kings were temporary concerns in the grand scheme of things. "You're brooding again," came Queen Virginia's gentle admonishment as she approached through the trees, moving more steadily now than when they'd first arrived. "Thinking," Melissa corrected. "There's a difference." Virginia smiled. "You remind me of Thomas when you say such things." She joined Melissa on the fallen log. "We can't wait much longer. Maxwell's anniversary celebration is in 3 days. Our best opportunity to strike while the court is gathered. We can't go without Thomas," Melissa insisted. "We may have no choice, child. The plan doesn't necessarily require his presence, only proof of Maxwell's crimes and your legitimate claim to Fairhaven." Melissa turned to face the Queen. "I won't give up on him." Virginia studied her with those penetrating blue eyes so like her son's. "Nor should you. But remember why we fight. Not for personal vengeance or even love, but for justice, for the people suffering under Maxwell's rule." Before Melissa could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of their camp. They hurried back, Virginia leaning on Melissa's arm to find the sentries confronting a hooded stranger at sword point. "He refused to state his business," one guard explained. "Just said he needs to see the princess immediately." "Remove his hood," Melissa ordered. As the guard reached forward, the stranger moved with surprising speed, disarming him with one fluid motion that seemed strangely familiar. The other guards raised their weapons. But the man made no further aggressive moves. Instead, he slowly raised his hands and pulled back his own hood. Matted dark hair framed a face gaunt with exhaustion and half covered by an unkempt beard, but there was no mistaking those ice-blue eyes. "Thomas," Melissa whispered, her heart stopping before racing forward. He swayed slightly. "Forgive my dramatic entrance. I wasn't certain whose camp this was until I heard your voice." Melissa rushed to him, propriety forgotten as she wrapped her arms around him. He stiffened momentarily, then relaxed, his good arm encircling her waist, while his injured one hung at an awkward angle. "You're alive," she breathed against his neck, inhaling his scent of pine and smoke, and something uniquely him. "Barely," he admitted, his voice rough with exhaustion. "But I made it." A soft cry from behind them made Thomas look up, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Mother," he whispered, as though fearing she might be a hallucination. Queen Virginia stepped forward, tears streaming down her lined face. "My son, my beautiful boy." Thomas released Melissa and moved as if in a trance toward the woman he had believed dead for 15 years. He reached out with a trembling hand to touch Virginia's face, assuring himself she was real. "How?" he managed, his usually controlled voice breaking. "Later," Virginia promised, pulling him into a gentle embrace, mindful of his injuries. "Rest first. You're safe now." Dawn found Thomas cleaned, bandaged, and somewhat restored after a night of proper rest. The arrow wound in his shoulder had become infected during his days in the wilderness. But Lady Margaret's herbal knowledge and Melissa's careful nursing had reduced the fever. Now he sat with his mother, Melissa, and their core allies around the camp's central fire, filling in the gaps of their respective journeys. I led the king's men on a chase for 2 days before losing them in the northern marshes, Thomas explained, wincing as he shifted position. By then, the infection had set in. I found shelter with a charcoal burner's family who risked everything to hide me. And once you recovered, Lord Aldrich, one of their noble allies, asked. I didn't wait to recover fully. Time was too precious. Thomas glanced at Melissa. I tracked rumors of a hidden camp gathering those loyal to the forest princess, as they're calling you. Melissa blushed. The people have active imaginations. They have hope, Thomas corrected. Something in short supply under my father's rule. He turned to his mother, still marveling at her presence. I still can't believe you're alive, all these years. I survived on the thought of seeing you again, Virginia said softly. And now we must ensure your father pays for his crimes against both our kingdoms. Thomas nodded, his expression hardening. Agreed, and I haven't returned empty-handed. He pulled a worn leather pouch from inside his tunic. The charcoal burner's son works in the palace smithy. Through him, I was able to make contact with others still loyal to our cause. From the pouch, he produced a small scroll sealed with the royal emblem of Westbrook. Captain Wilson managed to smuggle this out before his execution. It's a sworn testimony from the Countess of Hawthorne, detailing her role in the false accusations against my mother and the planned invasion of Fairhaven. Lady Margaret's eyes widened. The Countess betrayed Maxwell. I never thought she had the courage. Fear can inspire courage in the most unlikely places, Thomas replied. With Blackwood's rise in favor, the Countess realized her position was precarious. This was her insurance policy. Is it enough? Lord Aldrich asked skeptically. Combined with the documents we already possess, and Queen Virginia's testimony, yes, Thomas said confidently. But we need to present this evidence where it cannot be denied or suppressed, before the entire court and foreign emissaries. The anniversary celebration, Melissa realized. All the nobility will be present, along with delegations from allied kingdoms. Thomas nodded. Exactly. 3 days from now. My father celebrates 15 years since his great victory over Fairhaven, the perfect time to reveal the truth of how that victory was achieved. But the palace will be heavily guarded, objected Sir Roland. Their military commander. How do we get inside? I still have friends in the Royal Guard, Thomas explained, and Lady Margaret's position hasn't been compromised. They believe she was kidnapped during our escape. I can return, claiming to have escaped captivity, Lady Margaret suggested. That would place me inside to help coordinate, and I know every secret passage in that palace, Thomas added. We don't need an army, just a small elite group to enter undetected. As they continued planning, Melissa watched Thomas with mixed emotions. The man who had returned to them was somehow both harder and softer than the one who had left, his determination tempered by something new, a depth of feeling that showed in the gentleness with which he treated his mother, and the way his eyes frequently sought Melissa's across the fire. Later, as the others dispersed to prepare, Thomas pulled Melissa aside, leading her to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. For what? For that kiss before we separated. His face remained serious. It was impulsive and presumptuous. Melissa felt her cheeks warm. You thought you might die. People often act impulsively in such moments. That's not why I did it. He turned to face her fully. I did it because I wanted to, because I had been wanting to for weeks. But our arrangement was supposed to be political, not personal. Things change, she said softly. Yes, they do. He reached for her hand with his uninjured one. When I was out there, alone and fevered, thinking I might die in those marshes, it wasn't vengeance that kept me fighting to survive. Melissa's heart quickened. What was it? You, he said simply. The thought of seeing you again, of having the chance to tell you that what began as convenience has become the most important relationship in my life. She moved closer, emboldened by his honesty. I felt the same absence, as though part of me was missing while you were gone. Thomas's eyes, usually so guarded, now revealed everything he felt. Oh, if we survive what's coming, Melissa, or Scarlet, whichever you prefer, I want our marriage to be real. Not a political alliance, but a true partnership. It already is, she whispered, rising on tiptoes to press her lips gently to his. The kiss was different from their first, not desperate or rushed, but tender, a promise rather than a farewell. When they separated, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "We could die in 3 days," he reminded her. "Or we could win," she countered, "and begin building something better than either of us imagined." As they stood together overlooking the kingdom that had caused them both so much pain, Melissa realized how completely her life had transformed in just a few short months. From stable girl to princess, from solitary survivor to a woman deeply in love, she had found her true identity, and with it, the courage to reclaim not just her birthright, but her future. 3 days until they risked everything. 3 days to prepare for justice or death. Whatever came, they would face it together. The Westbrook Palace Great Hall gleamed with unprecedented splendor. 15 years of plundered wealth from conquered kingdoms had been transformed into lavish decorations celebrating King Maxwell's glorious victory over Fairhaven. Golden banners bearing the Westbrook crest hung alongside war trophies, including the shattered crown of Fairhaven's fallen king, displayed prominently behind the throne. Nobles from across the realm mingled with foreign dignitaries, their nervous laughter betraying the tension that had permeated court since Prince Thomas's treasonous escape. The king himself sat rigid upon his throne, his face carved in stone as he watched the celebrations with cold, calculating eyes. Beside him, the Duke of Blackwood stood vigilant, hand resting perpetually on his sword hilt. In the shadows of a servant's passage behind the tapestries, Melissa adjusted her simple handmaiden's disguise. Lady Margaret had returned to court 3 days earlier, her tale of escape from the traitors accepted without question. Now she stood at Melissa's side, her experienced hands making final adjustments to their plan. "Remember," the older woman whispered, "timing is everything. Wait for Thomas's signal before revealing yourself." Melissa nodded, her heart pounding. Somewhere across the vast hall, Thomas and his loyal guardsmen were positioning themselves, waiting for the precise moment when the king would call for the traditional toast to his victory. Queen Virginia remained hidden with Lord Aldrich in the antechamber, their presence the final piece of their carefully orchestrated revelation. "Are you afraid?" Lady Margaret asked softly. "Yes," Melissa admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing, of letting this monster continue his reign unchallenged." The lady-in-waiting squeezed her hand. "You've shown more courage in these past months than most show in a lifetime. Whatever happens tonight, you've already won by becoming the woman you were meant to be." A trumpet blast announced the commencement of formal ceremonies. Through a gap in the tapestry, Melissa watched King Maxwell rise, his jeweled crown catching the light as he spread his arms in a gesture of welcome. "Nobles of Westbrook, honored guests," he began, his powerful voice carrying throughout the hall. 15 years ago, we secured our kingdom's future through decisive action against those who threatened our borders. Tonight, we celebrate not just that victory, but the peace and prosperity it has brought to all our lands. Hollow laughter echoed through Melissa as she listened to the king rewrite history. Peace, prosperity. The outer villages starved while nobles grew fat. Families had been destroyed, kingdoms erased, all to satisfy one man's ambition. The king raised his goblet, a toast to Westbrook's greatness. As the assembled guests lifted their cups, a commanding voice cut through the response. "Before we drink to lies, perhaps we should hear the truth." The crowd parted as Thomas strode forward, no longer hidden among the guards. He wore his formal military attire, the medals and insignia of his battlefield accomplishments gleaming on his chest. Unlike during his escape, he now stood tall and uninjured. Every inch the crown prince and heir, gasps and whispers erupted throughout the hall. The king froze, goblet halfway to his lips, momentarily stunned by his son's audacity. "Guards," Blackwood barked, "seize the traitor." But the royal guards remained stationed at their posts, making no move to apprehend Thomas. Several even shifted subtly, hands moving to their swords, not to threaten the prince, but to protect him. "They won't follow your orders tonight, Duke," Thomas announced. "Too many of them have lost brothers to my father's endless wars. Too many have watched their families suffer while the crown hoards wealth." The king recovered his composure, setting down his goblet with deliberate calm. "So the prodigal son returns, with treason on his lips and rebellion in his heart." His voice hardened. I welcomed you back once, Thomas. There will be no second chance. I don't seek your forgiveness, Father, Thomas replied. I seek justice. For Westbrook, for Fairhaven, and for every person who has suffered under your rule. Maxwell laughed coldly. Justice? You speak of justice while consorting with our enemies, while plotting with your foreign whore to undermine this kingdom. The only enemy of this kingdom stands before me, Thomas countered. And as for my wife, he turned toward the servants' passage. It's time. This was her cue. Taking a deep breath, Melissa stepped from behind the tapestry. Lady Margaret followed, quickly removing the servant's cloak to reveal the gown beneath, silver blue silk embroidered with the royal crest of Fairhaven, the same gown she had worn at the midsummer ball. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Melissa walked forward to stand beside Thomas, no longer a frightened stable girl or even the prince's controversial bride. She moved with the natural grace of her birthright, her copper gold hair arranged in the traditional style of Fairhaven royalty. I present to you, Thomas announced, his voice ringing through the hall, Princess Scarlet of Fairhaven, rightful heir to the throne that King Maxwell illegally seized 15 years ago. The king's face contorted with rage. This is absurd. Fairhaven's royal line was extinguished. This woman is a stable girl, a nobody who bewitched my son. A stable girl with a royal birthmark, Melissa countered, her clear voice carrying across the stunned assembly. She lowered the collar of her gown just enough to reveal the silver star mark on her collarbone. A princess saved by a loyal servant during your treacherous attack. An attack launched not to secure our borders, but to steal ancient maps and expand your empire. Several of the older nobles murmured in recognition. One elderly duchess stepped forward, peering at Melissa's birthmark. It's true, she gasped. The mark of the Fairhaven royal line. I attended Queen Isabella's court. I saw this same mark on her. Lies and theatrics, Blackwood snarled, drawing his sword. Your Majesty, allow me to end this farce. Wait, called a voice from the crowd. The Countess of Hawthorne, her face pale but determined. There is truth in their accusations. All eyes turned to the king's longtime confidant. Maxwell's expression darkened dangerously. Hold your tongue, Countess. But the woman continued, years of guilt finally breaking through her fear. I testified falsely against Queen Virginia at the king's command. She never committed treason. Her only crime was discovering his plans to invade Fairhaven unprovoked. And for that, Thomas added, he had her poisoned. She died 15 years ago, the king growled. Everyone here witnessed her burial. Did they? Thomas challenged. Or did they witness an empty coffin and your elaborate lies? He gestured toward the main doors, which opened to reveal Queen Virginia, flanked by Lord Aldrich and 2 loyal guards. Though thin and bearing the marks of her long imprisonment, she stood straight and regal, her resemblance to Thomas unmistakable. The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles fell to their knees, others backed away in shock, as though seeing a ghost. Foreign dignitaries whispered urgently to one another, recognizing the diplomatic disaster unfolding before them. Maxwell staggered backward, his face draining of color. Impossible, he whispered. Nothing is impossible for a king who believes himself above all laws, Virginia said, her voice soft but carrying in the sudden silence. You kept me alive because you feared my family's retribution if you killed me. Instead, you buried me alive beneath your castle, while my son grew up believing me dead. Thomas presented the documents they had gathered, the Countess's sworn testimony, Queen Virginia's original warning to Fairhaven, the records of Melissa's birth bearing the royal seal. Every person in this room has suffered from your lies, Thomas declared. Every kingdom represented here has been betrayed or manipulated by your false diplomacy. The assembled nobles and dignitaries murmured in agreement, the atmosphere shifting palpably as years of suppressed grievances found voice. Maxwell's eyes darted around the hall, recognizing his rapidly deteriorating position. With a sudden movement, he lunged forward, drawing a concealed dagger from his sleeve and charging, not toward Thomas, but toward Melissa. If Fairhaven must die again, so be it, he snarled. Thomas moved instantly, intercepting his father and knocking the blade from his hand. The 2 men grappled briefly before Thomas pinned the king against a pillar, his arm across his father's throat. It's over, Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. Surrender your crown and face justice for your crimes. For a moment. It seemed Maxwell might yield. Then a twisted smile crossed his face. "I will never surrender to you, boy. Never." With surprising strength, he shoved Thomas aside and darted toward the balcony doors. Guards moved to intercept him, but the king was faster. Fueled by desperation, he flung the doors open. Cold night air rushing into the hall. "You think you've won," he shouted, backing toward the balcony's edge. "Westbrook will tear itself apart without me. Everything I built will crumble." "No," Melissa replied, stepping forward. "We'll rebuild something better. Something built on truth and justice, not fear and conquest." Maxwell's face contorted with hatred. "You speak of justice. There is no justice in this world. Only power, and those too weak to seize it." With those final bitter words, before anyone could reach him, the king stepped backward off the balcony's edge, choosing oblivion over the humiliation of defeat. A collective gasp went up from the crowd, followed by stunned silence. Thomas rushed to the balcony, looking down at his father's broken body on the stones far below. His expression revealed complex emotions, not triumph, but a solemn recognition of tragedy and waste. When he turned back to the assembled court, his voice was steady. "The reign of King Maxwell is ended. Let justice and healing begin." One by one, the nobles of Westbrook knelt before Thomas, Virginia, and Melissa, acknowledging the truth of their claims and the legitimacy of their cause. Foreign emissaries stepped forward, offering renewed alliances based on honesty rather than intimidation. The Duke of Blackwood, seeing his position collapse, attempted to flee, but was quickly apprehended by the royal guards, many of whom had suffered under his harsh command. As dawn broke over Westbrook Palace, Thomas and Melissa stood together on the balcony, watching the sun rise on the first day of their new reign. The path forward would not be easy, rebuilding two damaged kingdoms, healing old wounds, establishing trust where fear had ruled for so long. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked. Taking her hand in his, Melissa gazed out at the kingdom that would now be partly hers to guide. Not alone, she admitted. But together, yes. Their fingers intertwined. The Prince of Westbrook and the Princess of Fairhaven stood united, their personal journey from vengeance to love mirroring the transformation they hoped to bring to their people. "Our love was born from pain," Melissa said softly, echoing the vows they would soon speak at their true wedding. "But it will not be defined by it." Thomas squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the rising sun. "You taught me there's power in mercy. Our story begins where I thought everything would end, and so it did. A new chapter for two kingdoms, written not in blood but in hope, not in conquest but in union, proving that even from the darkest intentions can bloom the brightest light of all."